This video contains multiple spoilers for Dead Space. You've been warned. Dead Space was a game I always wanted to love. Like, it feels like a game designed to scare the hell out of me. Growing up, films like Alien and The Thing cemented sci-fi horror as one of my favorite genres of movies, and in turn, video games as well. Just the idea of being isolated on a remote facility in a frozen tundra or the bottom of the ocean or the endless void of outer space with no hope for rescue is already enough to get me feeling claustrophobic. Add in an alien threat lurking in the shadows that I'm forced to confront with nothing but my limited supplies and my wits, and you've got the recipe for giving me a heart attack. I also loved the concept of the dismemberment system. The classic aim for the head trope is pretty standard at this point, and I've already played so many games that stick to the classic pistol, shotgun, rifle, grenade launcher progression system. So when I learned that necromorphs, Dead Space's cosmic spider-like take on zombies, could be decapitated, bifurcated, and still keep coming for your throat unless you slow them down by blasting off their limbs, it already had my curiosity, but now it had my attention. This clever twist meant that combat no longer felt straightforward but surgical, and the unique array of mining equipment that you use as makeshift weaponry is both creative and adds to the feeling of desperation in the narrative since you're fighting for your life with nothing but the tools you happen to have on hand. So after years of anticipation and procrastination, I finally booted up Dead Space for the first time in October of 2021 for a spooky Halloween stream. And by the time the credits rolled, I was feeling underwhelmed. Alright, I know what you're thinking, but just give me a chance here. I definitely liked Dead Space, I just didn't love it. Don't get me wrong, the premise and the gameplay lived up to the hype, mostly, but some aspects of their execution kept it from feeling like the masterpiece I was led to believe it was. While the USG Ishimura's grimy industrial aesthetics, evoking comparisons to the Nostromo or the Event Horizon, make for a classic sci-fi horror setting, I found its level design to be disappointing. I'm a fan of the Resident Evil series, and I love the classic survival horror level design of a slowly expanding labyrinth that lends itself to exploration and backtracking. So when I heard that Dead Space was inspired by the Resident Evil series, it was a little bit of a letdown when I realized its chapters were entirely self-contained levels, and that I was restricted to one segment of the ship at a time. The average chapter structure is this. You take the tram to a new wing of the ship, progress through while fighting monsters, complete your tasks or fetch your key items, and then get back on the tram that takes you to the next chapter. Rinse and repeat. This structure isn't inherently bad and can in fact be really effective when a game uses it to string together a variety of unique locations to keep things fresh. But in a game that takes place entirely in a singular location with a fairly uniform visual design, going the route of the more immersive experience by having it all be interconnected would make the most out of the setting. Instead, the linear structure leads it to feeling a bit wasted to me, and also resulted in the scripted jump scares becoming predictable after a few hours, leaving me feeling more annoyed than I was afraid. As for the combat, it absolutely offers the intense moments of visceral gratification that it advertises. But when crafting a survival horror game's combat system, there's a careful balance that needs to be considered. If the player has no way to effectively defend themselves, encounters basically boil down to a game of hide and seek. Some people like horror games that use this approach, like Amnesia or Outlast, but it does make for an objectively less engaging experience, since you're more so running away from the horror than trying to confront it. On the other hand, if you give the player too much power, then all sense of tension or desperation is removed. Dead Space leans a bit too far into the latter for my liking. You're given what's arguably the best weapon in the game, the iconic one-size-fits-all plasma cutter, right from the start. This thing is stupidly OP, and even on hard difficulty with no upgrades, 2 or 3 shots will usually sever a limb. Medkits are also super common to find, so I rarely felt that I was truly in danger. I also wish the game encouraged experimentation in combat more than it does. With the exception of the plasma cutter, additional weapons must be purchased from the store after being unlocked through finding their schematics. This normally wouldn't be a problem if the game showered you with cash and upgrade points the way it does health packs, but it doesn't, and the weapons are relatively expensive because of it. And considering there's no way to test out a weapon before you buy it, I often opted to just buy more upgrade nodes or plasma cutter ammo instead of risking buying a weapon only to find out it wasn't very fun or useful. I'm looking at you, Flamethrower. Those are my two biggest issues with the game, but there are a lot of little things that start to add up after a while. The zero-G sections, while being a cool idea, came off kind of gimmicky and usually felt more irritating than immersive to play through. The infamous ADS cannon section just feels so out of place and unnecessary. And the story, while interesting in its lore, was difficult for me to get emotionally invested in. Part of this has to do with Isaac being a silent protagonist. In a game like Half-Life 2, a silent protagonist works because the story isn't about you, you're just an everyman player insert that's witnessing events occur around him. But in Dead Space, your relationship to Nicole and how it connects you to the rest of the events of the game is the core of the narrative. And since I can't see or hear how the events of the story affect Isaac, I don't feel any attachment to his personal struggle. I know my critiques probably sound really harsh or nitpicky, but I swear I did like Dead Space. I understand this game came out 13 years before my first playthrough. Like many 7th generation games, hardware limitations of consoles at the time meant that compromises had to be made, and prioritizing detailed environments, graphical fidelity, and complex physics probably had to come at the expense of more intricate level design. And being the first game in the series, of course there were going to be some mechanical missteps and some ideas that didn't quite hit the mark. With that in mind, I enjoyed Dead Space for what it was, a fun, gory action romp through a creepy haunted house in space. But considering I was expecting and hoping for an immersive survival horror experience, I couldn't help but feel a tad disappointed. And by the end, my overall thoughts could be summarized as fun, but overrated, and left me with little interest in playing through the rest of the series. So when the remake was announced, my hype levels were basically non-existent. Now, I'm not as cynical about remakes and remasters as some people are. These days, more and more games are becoming unplayable on modern platforms due to limited backwards compatibility, being caught in IP rights limbo, or just straight up being delisted. I think that game preservation is really important, and if a remake does its job well, it'll allow a new generation of players to experience a game they may have otherwise missed. The most we can usually ask for is faithfulness to the original, decent performance, and a shiny new coat of paint. That said, considering my first gameplay experience with Dead Space left me feeling lukewarm, those improvements alone were not going to be enough to get me excited. Really, it was Susie the Sphere Hunter's video that actually wound up inspiring a feeling of cautious optimism and sold me on giving Dead Space a second chance. You can find the link to her video in this video's description. I highly recommend checking it out as well as the rest of her videos. She is like the survival horror queen. So after all of that, you might be wondering, how do you feel about the remake? Well, I'm really excited to say that Dead Space Remake not only fixes every single issue I took with the original game, but improves and expands on all of the parts that I found fun in the first place. It's literally like the devs took all my notes and created the game that I had always wanted Dead Space to be. For starters, remember when I said I was hoping for more open level design? They did it. All of the segments of the Ishimura from the mining deck all the way to the bridge are now fully interconnected. From the beginning of the game all the way up to the point of no return in the final chapter, you can backtrack to any room or hallway whenever you want. The scale of these levels have also increased. Existing rooms are more spacious, and entirely new rooms have been added as well. This means that the Ishimura's full potential has finally been realized. It now feels less like a theme park ride of spooky set pieces and more like an actual real-world environment, making it the most immersive space station I've seen in a game since Prey's Talos 1. But simply connecting all the previously segmented sections wouldn't mean much if there wasn't an incentive to backtrack. As you progress through the story, you'll stumble upon boxes, lockers, and even entire rooms that are locked behind security clearance levels. As you progress through the game, your clearance will be upgraded at key story moments, and that means that those previously inaccessible goodies are now waiting for you to come and scoop them up. And when revisiting these early areas, any potential enemy encounters are procedurally generated, which means that you're constantly on the edge of your seat, not knowing if danger lies around the corner. Speaking of enemy encounters, combat's limitations and balancing issues were addressed as well. The plasma cutter is still one of the best weapons, but it's nowhere near as OP as it was in 2008. Enemies can now take way more shots, and medkits are far more scarce. So every missed shot really stings, and the fear of getting overwhelmed without ammo or healing items makes all of the fights feel so intense, and much more akin to the survival horror vibes that I was looking for originally. Also, weapons have been significantly retooled with new and improved alt fires, and are found organically as item pickups as you progress through the game. Instead of unlocking new weapons, schematics now unlock upgrade trees and brand new effects that you can apply to your weapon, such as fire damage over time on the plasma cutter. And upgrades no longer require you to waste nodes to bridge the gap between them and can be fully reset for 5,000 credits if you decide you want to allocate those nodes elsewhere. This means that player expression and customization of your weapon loadout has never felt more flexible. My preferred loadout was the plasma cutter for general dismemberment, the pulse rifle if I needed to lay down suppressive fire or an explosive mine, the flamethrower, which is now far from useless if I just needed to burn every motherfucker in the room, and the line gun for setting up laser tripwires, as well as other more creative uses. So my two biggest issues were definitely addressed, but what about all those little nitpicks that I had? The 0G point jump sections? Fixed. You now have full 3D range of motion while in 0G, making traversal and even exploration of areas like the hangar bay a blast. By the way, fun detail, if you go back to the Kellyan after it explodes, you can find Johnson's body floating inside. I don't know why I mentioned this, I just thought it was really fucking cool. The ADS cannon section has been completely reworked and is actually really creative and fun now. Isaac is also now fully voice acted and all of the other side characters have been fleshed out, and the story is overall presented in a more captivating way that actually got me feeling invested and wanted to dive deeper into the greater Dead Space lore. So it sounds like all of my gripes were addressed. I guess that's the end of the video.
But wait! There's more!
Kinesis has seen a significant upgrade. It feels a lot more weighty, and you can now pin enemies to the walls with poles or even their own claws. Enemies' skin, flesh, and bones now peel, burn, and break away in gruesome detail. Motive has added new optional side quests that you can follow that help flesh out what happened in the days leading up to your arrival, giving you even more incentive to explore. Some of the Ishimura's rooms now require you to divert power to either the lights or oxygen systems to power a door or an elevator, meaning that you'll have to choose between bathing the level in darkness or adding a ticking clock element, both of which work great to up the intensity. And obviously we can't forget about the graphics. Every room still retains the feeling of the original, but with more detail and character. Lighting in 2008 was obviously limited by the hardware. Now, realistic shadows and fog and flickering lights make for an atmosphere that you could cut with a knife. And for those of you that enjoy the game enough to play through New Game Plus with all your goodies still unlocked, there's even an alternate ending. So yeah, Dead Space Remake went from being a game that I had completely written off to what will likely be one of my favorite games of this year. It's inspired me to give the series a second chance and follow through with playing the rest of its entries in the near future. Although based on what I've heard, I'm not exactly looking forward to that one. But most importantly, while I do think that Remake is the definitive experience, it's made me realize that maybe I was a bit too harsh on the original. Sure, its flaws I've highlighted still apply, but I really didn't appreciate the original's strengths enough on my first playthrough. The Ishimura, even in its original form, is one of the creepiest environments that I've had the pleasure of experiencing. Isaac may not be some special trained government agent, but he uses his unique skill set as an engineer to solve problems and fight back in a way that feels believable to his character. The necromorphs are relentless, and each enemy type manages to feel both cohesive yet unique in their design and tactics. And the dismemberment system, as well as the completely in-universe heads-up display, were absolutely a breath of fresh air compared to other third-person shooters of its time. So really, I think the biggest disservice I did to the original is that I didn't play it sooner. A decade of hype and technical advancements since its release, along with my demanding assumptions of what the game would be, meant I was bound for a letdown, and that really isn't anyone's fault but mine. This game was always a gem. A dusty, dirty, uncut gem, but a gem nonetheless. It just took a little bit of polishing for me to see that clearly. And that is how I learned to love Dead Space. Hey guys, this video was a little rough around the edges, but it's my first foray into video essay content, and I'm looking forward to honing my skills and sharing my thoughts with you about more games in the future. The next game I'll be covering is a classic Nintendo title that I've been waiting for over 20 years to play. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.